Mysterious Lady Pool. A True Horror Story. Introduction. In the heart of the dense Blackwood Forest, there lies a secluded pool shrouded in mystery and fear. The locals whisper tales of a spectral woman who haunts its waters, luring the unwary into its depths. This Lady Pool, as it is called, has claimed many lives, and the stories have kept most people at bay, until now. Mark, an urban explorer with a penchant for debunking supernatural myths, decides to visit the pool to unravel the truth behind the legends. But what he uncovers is far darker and more horrifying than he ever anticipated. The story. Chapter 1. Into the woods. Mark adjusted his camera strap and checked his GPS. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled light on the forest floor. He had been walking for an hour, following an old, overgrown trail. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. He paused to sip from his water bottle and record a video. "All right, folks," he said, his voice cheery. "Day 1 of my Blackwood adventure. The infamous Lady Pool is just ahead. Let's see if we can find anything spooky." Despite his confident tone, there was a knot of unease in his stomach. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The chirping of birds faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Finally, he arrived. The pool was smaller than he expected, its surface smooth and dark like liquid glass. The surrounding willows dipped their branches into the water, giving the scene an ethereal quality. Mark set up his camera and began filming. He narrated the legends, mocking the idea of a ghostly woman. "It's probably just a trick of the light," he said, zooming in on the pool. "Or maybe some gas bubbles making the water ripple." As he spoke, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, melodic humming. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. The humming stopped. Mark shook his head. "Must be the wind," he muttered, though the air was utterly still. He continued filming, but his unease grew. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows lengthening. And then he saw her. A figure stood on the opposite bank, half hidden by the willows. She was pale, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, and her white dress clung to her slender frame. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto his. Mark's heart raced. He lifted his camera, but when he looked through the lens, she was gone. "Just my imagination," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. He packed up his gear and hurried back to his campsite. But the image of the woman stayed with him. He tried to rationalize it, but deep down he knew he had seen something real, and he wasn't alone in the forest. Chapter 2. The First Night. Mark sat by the campfire, staring into the flickering flames. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, but the silence around the pool lingered in his mind. He played back the footage he had captured, pausing when he thought he saw a faint shadow in the background. "Probably just a trick of the light," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. As the fire crackled, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woman's image haunted him, her hollow eyes, her unnatural stillness. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but there was no signal. At midnight, the forest grew quieter. The crickets stopped chirping, and a heavy stillness enveloped the area. Mark glanced around nervously. "Come on, man. It's just a story," he said aloud, trying to reassure himself. And then he heard it, a soft humming, faint and melodic, carried on the wind. His blood ran cold. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the direction of the sound, but the beam illuminated only trees and shadows. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. The humming stopped abruptly. Mark held his breath, listening intently. The silence was deafening, pressing down on him like a weight. Slowly, he backed toward his tent, keeping the flashlight steady. Just as he unzipped the flap, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to writhe, dancing just beyond the reach of his light. Mark crawled into his tent and zipped it shut, his heart pounding. He tried to sleep, but every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into an uneasy slumber. Chapter 3. The Pool's Lure. The next morning, Mark awoke to find his campsite undisturbed, though the sense of unease lingered. He reviewed the footage again but found nothing definitive. Determined to debunk the legend, he decided to return to the pool. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, but still unnervingly quiet. When he reached the pool, he noticed something strange. The surface, which had been still and dark the day before, now shimmered faintly, as if lit from within. Mark approached cautiously. He knelt at the edge and dipped his hand into the water. It was icy cold, sending a shiver up his arm. As he withdrew his hand, he noticed faint ripples spreading outward, though nothing had disturbed the surface. He set up his camera again, this time focusing on the water. "If there's anything here, show yourself," he said, his voice firm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the humming began again, soft and mournful, growing louder with each passing second. Mark's breath quickened. He turned toward the sound and saw her once more. The woman stood at the edge of the pool, her pale figure shimmering like a mirage. Her eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to pierce through him. Slowly, she raised a hand and beckoned. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The humming grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. The woman began to step into the pool, the water rippling around her ankles. Snapping out of his trance, Mark stumbled backward. "No, this can't be real," he stammered. He grabbed his camera and fled, not daring to look back. Chapter 4. The Truth. Unveiled. Back at his campsite, Mark frantically searched for information about the lady pool. He found an old article about a young woman named Eleanor who had drowned there decades ago. The townsfolk believed her spirit lingered, seeking revenge on those who disturbed her rest. The more Mark read, the more he felt a creeping dread. The description of Eleanor matched the figure he had seen. He realized he had underestimated the legends and the danger. Determined to leave the forest, he packed his belongings and set out. But as he walked, the forest seemed to shift around him. Trails he had followed easily before now led to dead ends. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. And then he heard it again, the humming. Mark quickened his pace, but the sound followed him, growing louder and more insistent. He broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred past him, and the forest seemed to close in, trapping him. Finally, he stumbled into a clearing, only to find himself back at the pool. The woman stood at the water's edge, her hollow eyes locked onto his. "Why are you doing this?" Mark shouted, his voice echoing. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the pool, disappearing beneath the surface. The water churned violently, and a cold wind swept through the clearing. Mark felt an irresistible pull toward the pool. He fought against it, digging his heels into the ground, but the force was too strong. As he was dragged closer, he caught one last glimpse of the woman's face, her expression a mix of sorrow and malice. Chapter 5. A Warning for Others. Days later, hikers found Mark's abandoned campsite. His camera lay by the pool, its footage intact. Authorities reviewed the recordings, but the final moments were corrupted. Blurry images of the forest, the pool, and a pale figure standing in the shadows. The townsfolk took it as a warning. The lady pool claimed another victim, and her song continued to echo through the forest, luring the curious and the unwary. Moral: The story of Mark and the Lady Pool is a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind skepticism and the lure of forbidden knowledge. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, for the cost of uncovering the truth may be far greater than we can bear. Experiment, a true horror story. Introduction. Dr. Elias Rowan was once hailed as the savior of modern medicine. His research into genetic engineering promised cures for incurable diseases, even hints at extending human life. But with each success, his ambitions grew darker. When ethics committees denied him permission to continue his experiments, Elias abandoned the formalities of civilization. He purchased an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Blackthorn Woods. The locals spoke of curses and eerie disappearances, but Elias dismissed these tales as superstitious nonsense. Here, in isolation, he resumed his work, guided only by his hunger for knowledge. He wanted to create the perfect human, a being immune to disease, stronger, faster, and smarter than anyone else. But perfection demanded sacrifice, and Elias was willing to pay any price. Chapter 1. The New Beginning. The mansion was a sprawling labyrinth of decaying corridors and forgotten rooms. Elias converted the basement into a state-of-the-art laboratory, its walls lined with vials of glowing liquids and monitors displaying endless streams of data. He spent months recruiting subjects, carefully selecting those whose disappearance would go unnoticed: runaways, drifters, and the desperate. The first few experiments were failures. Bodies rejected the modifications. Cells mutated uncontrollably. Elias watched in horror as his subjects dissolved into grotesque, writhing masses of flesh. Each failure left him more determined, more obsessed. Then came Subject 9, a young woman named Mira, lured by the promise of a cure for her terminal illness. She was strong, resilient, and, most importantly, desperate. Elias believed she would be the key to his breakthrough. Chapter 2. The Breakthrough. For weeks, Elias worked tirelessly. He spliced Mira's DNA with genetic material extracted from various species: an octopus for its regenerative abilities, a cheetah for its speed, and a wolf for its strength. The process was agonizing for Mira, but Elias assured her it was worth it. At first, the results were promising. Mira's body healed wounds in seconds, and her reflexes became superhuman. Elias was ecstatic, convinced he had finally succeeded. But then, the side effects began. Mira started hearing voices, whispers that grew louder with each passing day. Her skin occasionally rippled, as if something beneath it was trying to break free. And her eyes, they glowed faintly in the dark. Chapter 3. The Awakening One. Stormy night, Mira escaped her restraints. Elias found her in the woods, standing in the rain, her body contorted unnaturally. She spoke in a voice that was not her own, warning Elias of the horrors he had unleashed. "I am not Mira," she said. "I am what you created, and I am not alone." Before Elias could respond, Mira's body twisted violently, transforming into a grotesque amalgamation of human and beast. She lunged at him, claws tearing through his lab coat. Elias barely escaped, retreating to the safety of his laboratory, but the screams of Mira, or whatever she had become, haunted him through the night. Chapter 4. The Hunt. The next day, Elias discovered that Mira wasn't the only one affected by his experiments. The forest surrounding the mansion seemed alive. Trees shifted positions when he wasn't looking, and shadows moved without a source. He realized his experiments had somehow contaminated the environment, twisting the natural order. And now, the forest was hunting him. Chapter 5. The Forest's Wrath. Elias barricaded himself in the laboratory, frantically analyzing the data from Mira's transformation. He hoped to reverse the process, but the results were grim. The genetic modifications had destabilized, spreading like a virus. The forest had absorbed the mutated DNA, and now it was evolving, becoming an extension of Mira's monstrous form. The mansion groaned as though alive. Vines slithered through cracks in the walls, their tips sharp and glistening with a strange fluid. Elias watched in horror as the trees outside seemed to shift closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the windows. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the halls. They spoke of vengeance, of punishment for Elias's arrogance. Among them, Mira's voice was the most prominent. "You wanted perfection, Doctor? Rowan. Come and see what you've created." Chapter 6. The creatures emerge. That night, the mansion was besieged. Creatures born from Elias's failed experiments emerged from the woods, grotesque hybrids of man and beast, their forms twisted beyond recognition. They were his subjects, returned to exact their revenge. Elias fought back with makeshift weapons and the experimental serums he had created. But for every creature he defeated, 3 more appeared. The mansion became a battlefield, its once pristine halls drenched in blood and lit by the flickering glow of his monitors. Desperate, Elias retreated to the basement, sealing the door behind him, but the creatures didn't try to break through. Instead, they surrounded the mansion, their guttural growls vibrating through the walls. They were waiting for something. Chapter 7. Confrontation. Elias spent the next day in a feverish haze, working on a counter serum that could neutralize the mutations. His hands trembled as he mixed the volatile chemicals, knowing it was his last chance. As night fell, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The laboratory's lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Elias turned to see Mira, or what was left of her, standing in the doorway. Her body was a grotesque blend of human and animal, her glowing eyes filled with rage and sorrow. "You took my life, Elias," she said, her voice distorted. "And now you will answer for it." She lunged at him, but Elias injected her with the counter serum. For a moment, her body convulsed, and Elias thought he had succeeded. But then she laughed, a sound that chilled him to his core. "It's too late," she said. "The forest is alive and it won't stop until you're gone." Chapter 8. Escape or Destruction. Elias realized the truth. The mutations had spread beyond Mira and the creatures. The forest itself was the host now, and he was the virus. If he wanted to survive, he would have to destroy everything: the mansion, the lab, and himself. He rigged the laboratory's power supply to overload, creating a makeshift bomb. As he worked, the creatures outside grew restless, sensing his plan. The mansion trembled as they began their final assault. When the timer was set, Elias fled through an underground tunnel he had built as an emergency exit. Behind him, the mansion erupted in flames, the explosion tearing through the forest. The ground shook, and for a moment, Elias thought he had succeeded. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Elias emerged from the tunnel, coughing and covered in soot. The forest was silent, the creatures gone. But as he stumbled away, he noticed something strange. The ground beneath his feet was soft and pulsing, as if alive. He looked back at the burning forest and saw it. The trees were regrowing, their charred remains twisting into new, even more grotesque forms. Mira's voice echoed in his mind. "You can't escape what you've created, Elias. It's part of you now." Epilogue. Months later, rumors spread of a cursed forest where no one dared to enter. Those who ventured too close spoke of whispers in the wind and shadows that moved on their own. Elias was never seen again. Some say he became one with the forest, consumed by the monstrosity he had unleashed. Others believe he wanders the woods, searching for redemption that will never come. The moral of the story? When science disregards ethics, it creates monsters, both outside and within. Chapter 10. The Curse of Blackthorn Woods. Elias wandered aimlessly through the wilderness for days, the weight of his failure pressing heavily on his mind. Exhaustion and guilt blurred his sense of time. Though he had escaped the explosion, he couldn't escape the whispers that followed him. They were faint at first, like distant echoes, but grew louder the deeper he ventured into the woods. At first, he thought it was his guilt manifesting as hallucinations, but the forest seemed alive. Branches reached for him like skeletal fingers, the ground pulsated beneath his feet, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. He realized with dawning horror that the mutation had survived. The explosion had only angered it. By the third night, Elias could no longer sleep. His skin crawled with an unseen presence, and every shadow seemed to harbor eyes. He stumbled into a clearing, hoping for respite, only to find himself surrounded by grotesque figures emerging from the trees. They were his creations, Mira's grotesque form leading the pack. Her once human face was unrecognizable, stretched and warped into something monstrous, but her glowing eyes retained a flicker of humanity. "You can't run, Elias," she said, her voice a haunting mix of sorrow and rage. "You made us. You belong to us." Elias fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his sins. For the first time in years, tears streamed down his face. "I didn't mean for this," he whispered. "I just wanted to help humanity." Mira knelt beside him, her clawed hand gently resting on his shoulder. "And now you'll help us. Forever." The creatures closed in, and Elias let out a scream that echoed through the forest. Epilogue. The legacy of the experiment. Years later, Blackthorn Woods became a place of legend. Locals spoke of a cursed forest where travelers vanished without a trace. Occasionally, brave or foolish, souls ventured into the woods, drawn by curiosity or desperation. None returned. But some claimed to hear whispers when the wind blew just right, voices calling for help, for redemption. Others reported sightings of strange, glowing eyes peering from the darkness. The forest seemed to grow larger each year, its twisted trees spreading outward like a disease. Deep within its heart, a figure could sometimes be seen. A man with haunted eyes and a gaunt face, walking among the creatures like their shepherd. He was no longer Dr. Elias Rowan, the brilliant scientist. He was something else, something neither fully human nor fully monstrous. And as the forest grew, so did its hunger. Final moral. Science without ethics doesn't just destroy, it transforms. Ambition, unchecked by compassion, can turn even the noblest intentions into nightmares. Be careful what you create, for it may consume you. Setting or backstory.